I'm a biographer of Hayek, and Hannes, I'm delighted to be here to join in your celebration. Your charge to me was to tell the audience a little bit about what I learned in doing the biography of Hayek. And because I'm an intellectual historian, I already knew a lot about Hayek's ideas, so most of the stuff that was new that I learned had to do with his personal life. So I'll talk a little bit about that, although I will also be getting to the ideas. And I thought the way that I would organize the talk is that the places where I found these new things were in correspondence that I hadn't known about before. It was through interviews of family members and others who knew Hayek. And finally, a third source would be just simply archival work, which I had worked in his archives, but I visited, and my co-author, Hans-Jörg Klausinger, visited other archives as well. So we were gathering materials that was new to both of us in that process. And I'll just give a few examples from each of these areas about what we learned that was new. So Hayek had told people that he wasn't a very good student when he was a youngster, okay? And so this was a story that he always told. He said, my academic career was nothing to talk about. So in the family correspondence that we had between his parents, and also the correspondence that he had with his parents when he was in World War I, we got a better idea of his relationship, his family relationship. And I think he absolutely exasperated his father, because his father they were just on the edge of the upper middle class, but his father was a medical doctor who spent most of his time with his herbarium. He was interested in plants. So they weren't, they were just right on the edge. And he was paying for private school for his three sons. And Fritz was just too smart. His classmates said, look, his name is, they gave him a name of Lex for lexicon, because he knew everything. But he wouldn't do his homework. He wouldn't pay attention in class. And not only his father, but also some of the professors that he had, grammar school teachers, they could see. He was just, they thought he was lazy. And he wasn't lazy, he was simply bored, basically. He was too far ahead. And he actually skipped a grade. So we can see this in the family correspondence, his father complaining to his wife about, what's with this boy? And it even continued on in the correspondence that took place in World War I. His father was always didactic in his letters. He was saying, Fritz would complain about being bored at the front. It was a static front. His father would say, you should learn some languages. You should explore the plants in your region. You should do all these other things. And as an aside, Hayek later would say he learned how to curse in 10 different languages. So at least he was trying to follow through a little bit there. On the other hand, it was also clear that his mother simply doted on him. Quite the opposite from his father. He had two younger brothers, and late in life he said, I was my mother's favorite. And he wasn't saying it bragging or anything, he was just stating a fact. And I think that also comes through. A second surprise for me, and these war letters and also the letters from his trip to New York City were provided by Hayek's brother's grandson. Some of you may know him, Richard Zundrich, wonderfully gave us access to all of these wonderful letters. And what was surprising about the New York letters is anyone who's seen any of Hayek's other correspondence, he tends to be somewhat formal, certainly not excitable. In these letters, he was a wonderful raconteur. He was 23 years old. He spent 15 months in New York City. This is in the Roaring 20s. This is the age of the flappers. Women were wearing makeup and scanty dresses from his point of view in the streets. And he was sending back letters to say, American culture is horrible. I can't wait to get back to Vienna. And so many of the reactions were I think, standard European reactions for the first time in America, but this was America in its most visceral form. This is when all the skyscrapers were being built, so there was noise everywhere. The radio had just been developed as a commercial thing, and he would say, here's this wonderful device. Do we see Do we hear opera? He says, no, we hear these stupid pop songs from every corner. Yes, we have no bananas. You know, he would complain about these specifics. He was just a wonderful storyteller. And I didn't know that. That was part of Hayek, that he was actually quite good that way. Okay, so the interviews. So Bill Bartley, who was my predecessor as the general editor of the Collected Works, had done a number of interviews with Hayek, and they were useful. But the ones that I found most exciting were the ones with Hayek's daughter, Christine. I mentioned this to some people last night. She was someone who was very forthcoming. The very first time I met her, I said, well, so tell me a little bit about your father. And she goes, my father, I barely knew the man. She throws back her head and starts laughing. He was the professor in the study. And of course, she did know him, and she told me many, many stories, but she was getting at a specific aspect of their family life. I mean, he was very much of a workaholic, and in addition, he was working at the London School of Economics when she was a child. And at the LSE, he would teach courses in the daytime, and then he'd teach the same courses at night because LSE was a new institution, so they had day students and they had night students. So he often wasn't home. He was also frequently traveling. So he was, in that sense, the professor in the study. And he was during this period in particular, but I think really all of his life. He was a workaholic. He was someone who was just very, very focused on his work. So she didn't know him that well then. She actually came to know him much better afterwards as an adult, obviously. But as a kid, you know, he was kind of a distant figure. She had some lovely stories about when for those who don't know Hayek's life, he was in Vienna until the early 30s, and then he spent the next 20 years in London, and then the London School of Economics, evacuated to Cambridge during the war, and then subsequently he's back in London. So the period in Cambridge, she also we shared a lot about. One of the most delightful stories was, this was a guy who didn't really think about his own, he might have been concerned about property rights, but not his own property. He had this old rickety bicycle that he wouldn't lock up. He refused to get a lock. And so it would frequently get stolen. And then he'd find it again and just calmly ride it back and put it back in front of the house. So she said over and over again, his bicycle would be gone. There was another story that some of you may have heard, the story about Hayek in Cambridge, where he did air raid duty with John Maynard Keynes on the roof of King's Chapel. By looking at the records, he never talked about doing air raid duty with Keynes. I always thought it was a myth. And Christine kind of confirmed that this was the case. And she said, actually, he did air raid duty on the roof maybe once or twice, but he very quickly realized that, you know, it's really cold up there. And he didn't want to do that, but he did want to be a good, patriotic, naturalized citizen. So he did it in the basement. And she said what happened was that he and another professor would sit down there all night drinking tea, and they had a phone line up to the roof where there was some chump up there who was actually doing the air raid duty. And if there was any need for an alarm, they would call downstairs. So she said he very quickly figured out how to do air raid duty, but not do it up on the roof. A couple of things from the archives that were new. In particular, his correspondence with Fritz Machlup I thought was very illuminating. This is, for the academics in the room, kind of a morality story. He spent 7 years working on The Pure Theory of Capital, a book that is an important book, but probably was very little read. It came out in 1941, and obviously during the war, less read. And he struggled with it. You can see this in his correspondence with Machlup. Whereas in the middle of World War II, Machlup is in the United States, and okay, I'll stop it. And commissions him to write The Use of Knowledge in Society, which is his most famous paper. He wrote that paper in 4 or 5 weeks. So the morality tale is 7 years for something no one's going to read versus 4 or 5 weeks for his most famous paper. That was something that gave me some pause because I spent 10 years on the biography. So I hope some of you read it. Anyway, so the final source of new information is when people just through serendipity offer you information about Hayek that you didn't know. After I published the book, a person who was a student of Hayek's at the University of Chicago sent me a 100-page manuscript about his memories of not just Hayek, but all the people on the Committee on Social Thought, out of nowhere, very rich. And the other source is Hannes himself. So we first started talking, and our conversations were about Hayek, and then he told me these wonderful stories about experience he had had with Hayek during various meetings in the past, and then sent me his wonderful chapter in his book on 24 conservative and liberal thinkers. And there I have all of these things that will be incorporated in volume 2. But I also want to just recommend this book. I was amazed at the depth, the nuance of Hannes's treatment of The Road to Serfdom in it. I thought, I edited the collected works version of The Road to Serfdom. I thought, boy, this is, I wish I had read this before I had done my editor's introduction. This is great. And then I come to find out that he translated The Road to Serfdom into Icelandic. So I said, of course. So translating things sometimes is the best way to really get to know a thinker. So thank you again for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here, and congratulations on your retirement.